Stop the world! Welcome to Stop the World. I'm David Rowe.
And I'm Olivia Nelson.
Now, today's guest, Liv, is one of our favourites, and our listeners agree. He was extremely popular when he came on last year.
I think I actually brought him to your awareness, Dave, correct?
You did indeed. It's I blame The Economist for not having bylines. They should really look into the byline thing. Message to The Economist.
We are, of course, talking about Shashank Joshi, the Economist defence editor. Shashank is one of those rare commodities who can combine a deep understanding of strategy and military affairs with a talent for explaining complex ideas clearly and simply.
Yeah, he seems to know a lot about everything, and he's very good at knitting it all together into a global perspective, which is extremely valuable at a time like this when global forces seem to be reorganising themselves by the week.
It's a snappy episode of just under half an hour, but you guys have packed a lot in. We hear Shashank's views on the future of democracy in the United States, what this means for the rest of the world, and whether any kind of identifiable Trump doctrine has emerged from the US president's international interventions. Shashank talks about the constrained capacity of the US to play a constructive role in the world, the impact of Trump's short and sharp military interventions without lengthy entanglements, and what this approach means for his options on Iran. He talks about the significance of Europe's stand against Trump over Greenland at Davos, which he attended, and he talks about the deep uncertainty as to Donald Trump's overarching strategy towards China, and the significance of the latest military purge by Xi Jinping.
Yeah, I suppose the takeaway is his point about derisking, which of course we normally think about when we're talking about China, but now increasingly is being applied to the United States as well. I mean, that bumps up against reality in Australia's case pretty quickly when we think about AUKUS. But as Shashank sums up admirably, it's a ruthless purging of the sentimentality to our relationships with the United States, which put it far more elegantly than I was able to during the course of the conversation.
So there we have it. We hope you enjoy hearing the insights of Shashank Joshi.
Shashank Joshi, it's great to have you back on Stop the World.
Thank you so much for having me back. Great to be back on.
No, you're a popular guest. It's our pleasure to have you. So I want to start with the United States and the state of democracy in the United States. You post on it a lot. I realize you're defense editor of the Economist. That's your area of focus. But I mean, clearly, I chastise myself, frankly, from time to time for spending a lot of time reading US news. But I feel like sometimes I'm just caught up in the psychodrama of it. But then I realize, no, this is actually really, really important. Not just because the United States is the most powerful country on earth, but it's also Australia's must-have ally. We basically don't have a national strategy. We don't really have a plan B without the United States in some form that we recognize. So it really does matter. Just for the context of our viewers, I would point out that in the last week alone, we've had Trump threatening to federalize elections. Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence, overseeing FBI raids down in Atlanta on the election officers there. Apparently, they put the agents directly on the phone with Donald Trump. We've had the UAE's Intel chief and sovereign wealth fund boss buying just under half of the Trump family crypto company right before the US approved high-end chip sales to them. And there seems to be a highly classified whistleblower complaint against Gabbard that possibly hasn't even been shared with Congress yet. Shashank, how do you characterize the situation in the United States right now? And what do you see as the implication for the rest of the world, particularly allies like your country and mine?
Well, I think we have an obligation as journalists to look at democratic backsliding in the United States. Like many people in the United Kingdom, and I'm sure in Australia, we have just a strategic relationship to the United States, but we also have an emotional and very personal relationship to the United States. Like many Britons, I have family in the United States. I have studied in the United States. I've lived in different places in the US. And so that, I think, is reason enough. But also, what I see today, David, you may recognize this from your observations, is a certain self-censorship has also taken hold in parts of the US over describing the actions of the Trump administration. A self-censorship in some of your sister organizations, some US think tanks, in parts of the US press, which have been cowed into submission by this presidency. We see that with legal action against ABC News. My boss, our editor-in-chief, Zanny Minton-Beddoes, was on stage with Jamie Dimon, the boss of JP Morgan at Davos.
I saw that clip.
Him, Well, you saw when she asked him, why are business leaders terrified of criticizing Donald Trump? Is that right? And you could see him sort of panicking, the whites of his eyes, as he realized he had no way to answer this. So I am personally extremely concerned about US democracy. I see a full-blown rule of law crisis in the US, with not only ICE agents acting in a lawless way designed to intimidate opposition-held cities, but also language around future elections that makes me deeply concerned about the prospect of free and fair elections in the midterms. Now, all of that I care about regardless of America's status as an ally, but I care about it doubly because a US that is in this internal turmoil is a US that, simply put, is less able to help countries like Australia, the UK, Europeans on matters of enormous significance to all of us, like Russia, the Russian threat in Europe, cooperating on Chinese national security threats around the world. I worry about that very much.
Mm-hmm. And I agree with you there. I mean, even if Trump's intentions in particular instances where our countries are concerned might be relatively benign, even just the sheer capacity for the US system to manage everything going on internally and to play a constructive role in the rest of the world starts to come into question. Even as I say, assuming that the intentions are good. Let's talk about then his approach to foreign policy. I mean, one of the $64 million questions for as long as Trump has been a significant force in US politics has been, does he have a sort of overarching philosophy or doctrine? I mean, I think he's got sort of personal instincts that he's learned through his business background that he then applies to international affairs, and that's the closest thing that I've got. People are talking about neo-royalism now, which is an interesting new term that a couple of academics have coined. What have you learnt over the past slightly more than year in his second term that gives you some sense, if there is one, of an overarching sort of Trump doctrine?
Well, first of all, I think we must recognize the differences from his first term, in which he was, at least initially, quite seriously constrained by a set of more orthodox advisors. We saw this with Jim Mattis. Jim Mattis is his first defense secretary, who famously slept in his gym clothes, I think, during the North Korean crises, because he was so concerned about the prospect of the president ordering a reckless policy action on North Korea. We had H.R. McMaster, one of his first national security advisors, who, again, like many officials, fell out with him. Mike Pompeo was running the CIA, a very orthodox Republican hawk. I could go on, but there was a web of constraints around him. And that web began to completely break down in the final year in office. We remember those chaotic, tumultuous last months in office where he cycled through Chris Miller as his defense secretary. He tried to impose Kash Patel as his inspector general at the CIA. And we thought at the time, my goodness, he's going to appoint John Ratcliffe, an inexperienced congressman, as director of national intelligence. And now Ratcliffe looks like a towering figure of intellect in comparison with many of these other administration figures. We were worried about Kash Patel in a junior role at the CIA. Well, as we know, he's now running the FBI and is fully involved in weaponizing the Bureau against political enemies and gutting some of its most significant national security capabilities on counterintelligence. So that's one. The other thing I'd notice is, what we see is he is learning from his use of force around the world as well. And the two big events that have shaped this have been the attack on Iran last summer, Operation Midnight Hammer, which in his eyes, I think, would be viewed as a success, although that will now be shaped by whatever else subsequently occurs in Iran, but also by the Venezuela operation, the raid in Caracas to capture Maduro. I think it has honed, it has whetted his appetite for the use of military force and persuaded him and others around him that instead of abjuring military force completely, not that he ever did completely, and here I acknowledge the various counterterrorism actions that he undertook around the world, with huge numbers of strikes against the Houthis in Yemen, against ISIS in Somalia, which are ongoing. But I think that this has encouraged the view that America is able to conduct short, sharp, time-bound acts of force that bring about strategic benefits to the United States while avoiding the type of prolonged, entangled campaigns that so many of the people around him in his court, if we take your neo-royal analogy, like Tulsi Gabbard, J.D. Vance, have sought to avoid. And that's been the way the circle has been squared. I do think in Iran and the choices in front of him in Iran, we are seeing, I think, a degree of tension around some of this, because it's very hard to square that circle when it comes to the choices in Iran.
Yeah, yeah, and those two instances were, I mean, they were very elite, high-end operations, and both spectacularly successful on the military side. But interestingly, I mean, I would put forward that neither of them has been fundamentally changing for, I mean, those nations, the target nations, or the sort of strategic dynamics around them. I mean, we still have, we basically have the number two in the dictatorship now in charge in Venezuela. Trump clearly didn't have the stomach to back Machado as a truly democratic, reform of the nation. And in Iran, I mean, obviously Iran's, degradation has been happening over a period of time from Israel, the post October 7, 2023 operations by Israel right through to, to what we're seeing now, the recent uprising in January. But really the Fordo strikes on their own. I mean, yes, they clearly set back by some degree Iran's nuclear ambitions, but I mean, it doesn't seem to have of itself fundamentally changed the situation for Iran.
No, I agree with all of that. I think the jury is out. Certainly in Venezuela, the direction of the regime is very open. I think some substantial things have been achieved. America has genuinely changed the landscape around the oil industry in Venezuela. Of course, it will not be able to unlock the full scope of oil fields Donald Trump imagines, but nonetheless, the fact that oil is now flowing again, the embargo is being lifted, is significant. I think the jury is out, particularly in the impact this has on the rest of the region. I'm watching, as we speak, David, I'm watching Cuba very closely. We're clearly seeing the administration shift its emphasis to tighten pressure on the Cuban regime. The loss of Venezuela as an ally, if that is indeed what occurs, that could be a big win for Donald Trump in the Americas. If he can squeeze the Cubans out of Caracas, as well as the Russians and the Chinese. I'm not saying he can do it, but I'm saying I'm watching that very closely as an indication. And if he can persuade Mexico to cut off the supply of fuel to Cuba, which is now a major lifeline, and he's trying to do that now, you could see some quite dramatic changes take place in Cuba in the direction of that regime as well. So let's see where that goes. Yeah. On Iran, I think you're right. The Israeli strikes in Iran, the exposure of the regime as weak and hollow, the loss of Iranian proxies, the weakening of the proxies in Hezbollah, in Hamas, the degradation of the missile stockpile. These are all things that mattered as much as the US strike. But cumulatively, the regime does look to me extraordinarily vulnerable at this stage, just really exposed. And Iranian people deserve the credit for that first and foremost, of course. Going back to 2022 with the Women in Life protests, the protests against the mandatory hijab, this is not something we should attribute just to outsiders. But nonetheless, I have this sense that we could be looking at a very different Middle East this time next year when we resume this conversation.
Right. Yep, all very well put. Let's broaden this out to what it means for the rest of us. What are you thinking right now about some kind of new international structure without the US in any form that we recognize? I mean, you could possibly touch on the Carney philosophy, or the Carney doctrine, as he outlined it at Davos. But what are you thinking now about what's the way forward for the rest of the world? Especially non-superpowers like your country and mine. I mean, well, the UK is a great power. Australia is a quote unquote middle power. Not everyone loves that term, but for countries like ours, what do we do now?
Well, first of all, David, thank you for calling us a great power. That will warm our hearts of my countrymen when they hear that. But
you've got nuclear weapons, and you're still the fourth largest economy, I think. So.
Well, thank you for reminding us. I think we should talk about Carney's speech in a minute because it's quite an
Yeah.
interesting sort of intellectual construct around this.
Mm.
My view is that, look, on the one hand, I was in Davos a couple of weeks ago. I didn't get in the room for the Trump speech. I was in the throngs outside watching it, huddled in a corner with other journalists on a laptop. But what I saw there was a watershed moment, even more so than Munich 2024, 2025. I'm gearing up to go to Munich soon next week. But looking back to last year, the Vance speech, that was a wake up call. But Davos was a different sort of moment. And I say that because it was a moment at which Europeans feel they faced Donald Trump down on a particular issue, Greenland, and made him back down on his threat of acquisition by force. They pushed him into a deal that does not look like it is going to get him sovereignty over Greenland. It will be something short of that, possibly an elaboration of the 1951 agreement with Denmark. And for Europe, this was a moment that showed how they could achieve something collectively, facing down the United States. It was a moment that clarified, I think, also that the old assumptions were dying. That even if you want the Americans to be present and involved, Article 5, it has been heavily discounted, the credibility of this. And when Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, said Europe can't defend itself right now, get real, wake up, I think you saw quite an angry response amongst many countries in Europe who said, look, that may be the case now, but this kind of talk is now inappropriate for the times we live in. We must look beyond that and really articulate a post-American future. Now, having said that, I also want to be crystal clear, which is I think what we are looking at is, here's my way of looking at it. We're looking at a process of something we have applied in the context of China for a long time, which is de-risking. We are de-risking our alliances from the United States, which is to say we recognize that, if I take the UK context and you can come up with Australian examples, we all know the dependencies on defense, nuclear and intelligence. I know that Trident D5 nuclear missiles are meant to be in service in the UK till the early 2040s. I know that the future next generation Dreadnought SSBNs will have a common missile compartment with the Americans to carry Trident D5s. SSN AUKUS, I don't need to tell you how much that depends on US technology, and we know that that will begin entering service in the 2030s, 2040s, will last till the 2060s. F-35s, the last ones will be operating in UK service until the 2060s, assuming, we are not a smoldering radioactive wreck by then. And so you take all these things together, and let's get real. We are not going to totally unwind these dependencies. What we are going to do and can do, and I think must do, is de-risk in selected areas that we identify as priorities. Now, to give you one example, if I look at the UK and look at how we were able to provide Storm Shadow cruise missiles to Ukraine, but that they were unable to use them to maximum effect against the most well-defended targets without US geospatially derived battlefield intelligence, the answer clearly to me is we need allied means of battlefield intelligence that can operate without the United States to make our complex long-range munitions function, whether that is Tomahawk in the case of Australia, which you're buying in substantial numbers, or whether that is the Storm Shadow or the successor cruise missiles that we're working on with the French. That doesn't mean, we're going to magically have an SSBN or a nuclear ICBM, SLBM that is operable without the United States. Let's acknowledge that's if you want that, you're looking at spending 10% of GDP on defense, and that isn't going to happen right now. So we need a realistic conversation on what a de-risking agenda in the alliance looks like. That's my sense of it.
Yeah, and look, I got to say again, I'm in furious agreement here. And for Australia, it's AUKUS that is that brings it home that there is no realism to the idea that we can entirely decouple from the United States. I mean, we don't have we don't have a future military foundation without the AUKUS submarines. So that to me is where the conversation pretty much stops there around this idea of completely unwinding. But just to clarify what you're saying, I mean, what you're saying is that we can. I mean, as Europe showed in Davos, you can actually stand your ground on particular things in your relationship with the United States in order to make sure that your interests are not trampled upon. At the same time, you can continue to operate with eyes wide open in your relationship with the United States to get things out of the relationship that ensure your security and serve your interests. But you do it in a much more, in a de-risked, and I suppose, I don't want to say transactional, but a way that doesn't fall back on that, that age-old sort of idea that we had that around shared values revolved the fact that we would always sort of more or less work together and sort of help one another out. That is no longer a sort of something that we can fall back on.
Yeah, there's a sort of ruthless purging of the sentimentality around some of this. Those bonds of obligation, the bonds of history, those are sort of pushed aside. And you see that ruthlessness. By the way, you may have seen Elbridge Colby's Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, his speech in Seoul. A very blunt speech that sort of praised South Korea in some respects, but also did not mention North Korea. And striking for so many reasons. Striking because it raises profound questions about U.S. extended deterrence. Striking because it shows that focus on China in DoD, not DPRK. But also striking because it's sort of quite ruthless in saying to an ally, this is what you are useful for, not the other stuff that we've been doing. Now, I will say in the Australian context, we must be careful here about extrapolating from the European context to the Indo-Pacific context, because I've always felt in Europe we have this alternative spine to fall back on. This alternative set of alliance structures. Look at the Coalition of the Willing with the French, which is the Anglo-French initiative in which other countries have plugged in. And it's a plausible vision of a post-American military force that is kind of, a template to some mild degree. In the Indo-Pacific, let's be honest, you can combine the resources and capabilities of Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines, and you still have a huge problem in redressing the chasm that exists in the region's military power. On the other hand, what I would say is that the relationship with the US is quite different in the sense that we still don't fully know where this administration is headed when it comes to strategic competition with China. There have been some very troubling signs, no doubt about it, right? There's no mention of Taiwan in the NDS, although there is a mention of the first island chain. There is the chip sales to China. There's the very friendly outreach to Xi Jinping. Where is strategic competition going here? Nonetheless, let's be clear, there is a much greater basis to work with the United States on deterrence in Asia than I think in the long run there is to work with the United States on the deterrence of Russia in Europe, because this administration sees Russia as a potential partner, let alone not a serious threat. And future American administrations, even those that are more benign, I believe, will ultimately still inherit some of this deprioritization of Russia from the Trump administration, even if they dispense with the kind of Russophilia of elements, the most egregious elements of some of the Trump agenda.
Yeah. Look, you're quite right that Australia's lack of options, lack of alternatives, I should say, does, and I mean, I hate to think about it that way, but it's true, does make our dependency higher than, say, in a European country that has NATO to work with. But let's talk. I mean, you mentioned China. I mean, let's definitely just touch on China here for a moment. There's a couple of things that have happened recently. There was a call last night between Donald Trump and last night Australian time between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping. Trump has posted on Truth Social about that. They seem to have covered seemingly every topic, with soybeans included. But I mean, there is a very warm positivity in his tone. Of course, it was a brilliant call. They did discuss Taiwan, he says, which is useful to know if true. I don't recall any mention of chip sales, but Iran, I think Ukraine, all of these things got discussed. Keir Starmer copped a lot of flack for his visit. So, I mean, I suppose a couple of issues here. One is, I mean, what do you make of perhaps the temptation of some countries who are US partners to, I suppose, moderate their approach to their relationship with China a little bit, because it's very, very difficult to take an entirely principled stand with a risky or threatening superpower like China if you don't have a sort of values-based backing of another superpower like the United States. So that's one issue. But also, I mean, I suppose the uncertainty, as you put it, around what exactly is Trump, what is his long-term strategy with China? I mean, my suspicion is that his instinct is, again, a largely sort of transactional one, not one in which he has the appetite for long-term sustained strategic competition that looks to try and shape a China for the future that will be more benign towards the rest of the world. That's my gut feeling. But what do you think?
Well, I thought it was really interesting to read, to come back to that Bridge Colby speech, in
Yeah,
which there was such an enormous emphasis, much more so than deterrence, much more so than that, on stabilization,
yeah,
respect, an equilibrium. Everything you would read into that, had Joe Biden talked in those terms,
yeah.
I think you would have seen just a huge outcry from a lot of China hawks in the United States. But I think
And
it reflects a genuine belief in the Trump administration that, they don't want to change the status quo in Taiwan, but they want to be quite cautious in the way they do deterrence. And they want to avoid a situation where they cause China to feel backed up against a wall. Because I think and Bridge Colby has written about this, and, I think we've seen this in his writings for a while. There's a genuine sense you could provoke unnecessary aggression by the Chinese if you do that. So the net result, when you combine it with these interesting economic deals, the trade deals, the chip sales, you end up, and with everything Trump has said in the past about Taiwan, which is that it's insignificant, we don't really care about it, you end up with a very confused policy where allies don't know where they stand. Should we be all in helping America defend the first island chain and deterring everything? Or does that expose us to enormous risk if we're left holding the bag when the Americans do some kind of deal? And I think we just still don't know this a year into this presidential term. However, I will say all of this, of course, is occurring in the context of enormous instability inside China itself, in a week in which China has conducted unremarkable purges of its most senior military officer, a man who was a personal friend of Xi Jinping, in which he has gutted the Central Military Commission, completely, a remarkable purge. And our worry, my colleagues, is certainly that the result is that this has a short-term hobbling effect on the PLA, the People's Liberation Army. But over time, if these posts are filled with more pliant generals, and particularly generals with no experience of, major conflict, General Zhang was involved in Vietnam in the 70s, who were basically yes men, you end up with quite a dangerous situation where Xi Jinping feels he has a more pliant military leadership. There's less pushback from that leadership. And he sees in the Americans an administration that will be keen to de-escalate, do a deal, and this will be an opportunity to accelerate unification through coercive means, which Donald Trump will basically acquiesce to under the right terms. Therefore, I'm very concerned about the stability of the period now of the next 3.5 years of this remaining presidential term.
You're frightening me, Shashank. I've got to say, I'm not usually a terribly optimistic fella, but I'm just getting more and more scared here. But what did you interpret that? I mean, there are different readings of the purging of the senior general. Paranoia is one possibility. Seeking more compliant generals with an eye on Taiwan is another. What's your reading?
David, I'd be lying if I said I knew the peakonology
Nobody knows today.
properly.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
but I rely on my colleagues who are great China watchers and their judgment, spent time in Beijing and really looked at this closely. And, the sense is, yes, corruption is the gravity, it's a background effect. It's not the kind of proximate cause.
Yeah.
Of course, we saw the Wall Street Journal claim he may have sold nuclear secrets. I'm a little bit skeptical of that explanation. My sense is, look, he amassed too much power and he became not useful to Xi. I think John Culver's essay in the Foreign Affairs is quite a good explanation here, and I would encourage people to have a look at that. I'd also encourage people to look at our own briefing, our own piece on the subject that my colleagues wrote last week. I think that was written by Jeremy Page in Taipei.
Yep. Okay. Now we're on a tight clock. I've got to let you go in a moment, but let's just finish quickly on European security, because this is highly relevant. You wrote a piece recently on the big question of nuclear. I mean, ultimately, if Europe is going to fend for itself, and I agreed with everything you said about the Rutte. I'm quite sympathetic to European leaders on bristling at Rutte's remarks. But I mean, one thing that they will have to solve is a nuclear deterrent. Just give us a quick snapshot, like in a minute or so. What are the prospects for some kind of European independence on a nuclear deterrent, and therefore a standalone European security architecture?
Well, first of all, nobody thinks U.S. strategic deterrence is going. In fact, we're seeing the U.S. potentially look at building up warheads. We're also seeing things like the adoption of new theater-range nuclear systems like the submarine-launched cruise missile. So Europeans don't see this as we must replace the U.S. arsenal wholesale. This is, again, back to my point about hedging. And I think there's two dimensions. There's kind of UK-France, and there was a Northwood Declaration last year in which France promised something completely unprecedented. It said it would coordinate its nuclear forces more closely with Britain. That's a big step for anyone who knows the French and the importance they place on presidential latitude. We also have a Macron speech coming up on nuclear policy. I'm eagerly awaiting that. Then there is a separate effort by other countries to try to plug into Franco-British deterrence, particularly French deterrence. The Swedes are doing this. We're seeing conversations with the Poles. For example, participation in the French poker exercises. We're not at the point where we have the equivalent of dual-capable aircraft, where Italian, German, Belgian planes practice picking up US tactical nuclear weapons in Europe. But we're thinking about options. Could, for example, France deploy dual-capable aircraft more often to Eastern Europe, as they have done briefly to Poland and Sweden last year? Could they, at some point in the future, deploy air-launched nuclear weapons on German soil as a signal, as an assurance to allies? This is going to move slowly. Nothing's happening now, but I see these conversations gaining steam at an unprecedented pace, and that is what I'll be watching for over the next 6 months or so.
Fantastic. All right. Love your work, Shashank. I think we've gone around the world. We've circumnavigated the world very, very quickly there. I know you've got a call to make, so I'll let you get onto that. But please come back again soon. Love hearing from you. So thank you.
Thanks so much for having me, David. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Thanks for listening to Stop the World, folks. We'll be back soon with another episode.